Okay, so now we're moving on to variation, and basically, variation is a part of section C. Continuity and variation is a part of that section of the syllabus for CSEC Biology. And basically, if you need free resources, they are right here. You can go and check out those channels, and the email is also right here, and the study guide is right here. So basically, we're talking about genetic variation, and this is such a term that we use so often. And in the simplest form, when you talk about genetic variation, we're talking about the differences between the genes, differences in the DNA among individuals within a population or a species. So basically, we're focusing on differences. That is key behind genetic variation, and it's very important for us to have variation for a multitude of reasons, and overall, it's just better for survival when the population is not all the same and the population is different. And the number one way to get some variation is simply from sexual reproduction, as you know that asexual reproduction gives you clones, all the offspring exactly alike. Variation, on the other hand, gives you a variety, gives you diversity. Everyone in that population or in that species have a unique thing to them, even though they are related and they look almost alike, but they're not all the same. And it's almost like siblings, or within a family, you have siblings, and you have one that may be tall, then one short, then one medium height. So variation is very important for survival. So basically, when genetic variation is present in a population, individuals they are not genetically identical, which leads to differences in traits such as their height, skin color, disease resistance, or behavior. So basically, what that means is that even if on the outside they look alike, genetically they are not the same. No two people who are products of sexual reproduction are the same basically. Their genotype, if you remember what genotype is, and basically genotype is the genetic makeup of an organism. The genotype is always it's different, right? So it's different from the phenotype because you can have two individuals that look exactly the same on the outside with the same phenotype, and then when you check their genotypes are completely different. One might be dominant, and then you might have one that is heterozygous basically. So you won't know until you check the genotype basically. But we're saying that genetic variation, no two are genetically identical. So basically, how does variation arise? So basically, I said that the number one way is through sexual reproduction, and basically we're going to get down into it more and see the different ways that we can get some variation in our genes basically. So one way we have mutation right here, and mutations do happen. I would say they happen somewhat frequently, but not all. But most of the time, when mutations happen, they don't change much, if that makes sense. Not all the time. And basically, mutation is a change in a DNA sequence. Now, sometimes when this happens, you know that it can cause serious problems, such as people who end up with cancer, and that's simply because of the change in their DNA sequence, right? So sometimes you can have, I don't remember the term, but basically you can have the within a codon, and basically we're talking about your DNA sequence, but in the simplest terms, things can change in your DNA sequence. One of the nucleotides can be swapped out, and everything stays normal. And then in some cases, it can be swapped out, and then it causes a lot of problem, right? So Genetic variation does come from mutation, and we said that those are changes in the DNA sequence, and they can create new alleles. Then we have meiosis, and we know that meiosis only happens in sexually reproducing organisms, right? Just like how in cell division we say that mitosis happens in somatic cells, meiosis only happens in sex cells basically, and there are two important processes within meiosis that occurs to allow for this variation, and that is crossing over. If you remember, you have meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. In prophase 1 of meiosis 1, you're going to have crossing over, and that's basically when um, the sister chromatids, or is actually the homologous pairs, they're going to switch segments, and that allows for basically recombination, and that's where you get little variation. Then you have independent assortment, and that happens in metaphase 1, and that's basically when the chromosomes are lining up at the equator, when they're lining up in the middle of the cell. Basically, the rule is that they don't align up at the cell in any particular order, if that makes sense. They just line up completely randomly. And so by the time anaphase happens, where they're pulled to opposite ends of the cell, they're pulled like all over the place because they did not line up in any particular order, and that allows for some more variation, some more differences in the offsprings. Then we said sexual reproduction, common genes from two parents, unique offspring, and sexual reproduction and meiosis. Both of them kind of just go together, if that makes sense, because they are intertwined essentially. Because meiosis can only happen if sexual reproduction is happening, basically. And then you have gene flow, which is basically the movement of individuals between populations, and that helps to introduce new genes. You also have random fertilization. And the example that I would give is that during conception, when a woman gets pregnant, you have lots and lots of sperm cells, but only one will actually fertilize the egg, and only one will actually get the woman pregnant. That's also random fertilization. So it's not predetermined that, okay, this particular sperm cell is going to fertilize the egg. We have no idea which sperm cell is going to move the fastest and get to the egg first and fertilize it. So that's what we talk about random fertilization. So, what's the importance? Why do we need all of this variation? Why do we need all these differences? What's the purpose behind all of this, basically? So, it's very important to adapt to changing environments. It's important for disease resistance. It's important for evolutionary potential. It prevents inbreeding problems, and it ensures population survival. So, basically, if we put all of this in a summary, the importance of genetic variation is to increase our chances of survival, because disease resistance, if you can resist disease and you don't get sick or whatever, you're going to live. If you don't have inbreeding problems, you're going to live. So the goal behind genetic variation is to ensure that in a population at least some will survive. Because let's just say that the entire population is there. Let's just say the entire population, let's just use plants and say that we have some plants that were produced from, let's just say, asexual reproduction. They're all clones, all of them look the same, and something happens, a particular disease comes in, and because they're all the same, the disease is going to wipe all of them out one time, all of them dead. Versus if you had some plants that they did sexual reproduction, and now some of the plants are disease resistant, some are not. The disease come, and the ones that are not disease resistant, they die. And then the ones that are disease resistant, meaning that they're healthy and they're good, they survive. So that's the whole point of genetic variation, to ensure that, basically to ensure survival, or ensure that some survive from the offspring that are produced, basically. Then you have two types of variation. You have continuous and you have discontinuous variation. So continuous variation is basically one that shows a gradual change in the differences with no clear categories. It is usually influenced by many genes and environmental factors, example, human height. So if you look at this little chart, it's showing the gradual change. So you can see that it starts off low, then go up, again down, and the prime example of this would be human height. So it's basically a gradual change with no clear-cut categories. There's usually no clear-cut categories in this situation. Then you have discontinuous variation, and discontinuous variation has clear-cut categories with no intermediate. So basically this means it's either you are or you aren't. It's either you have it or you don't. So in continuous variation, we're talking about it, there was room for ambiguity, meaning that somebody can have height, somebody might be 5'1", 5'2", or 5 point this 5. But point is that there is room for, there's no clear-cut category to say, okay, you have to be this or you have to be that. With this continuous variation, there is clear-cut categories, meaning blood groups, for example, meaning that is either you're A, B, or O. There's no A-ish, there's no B-ish, there's no AB-ish. You have to fall into one of the categories. Basically, even with your gender, you have to either be male or female. There's no in between. There's no issues. Either you can roll a tongue or you can't. It's either your earlobes are attached or they're not attached. There's no in between, basically. And if you look at the graph, clear-cut category. This is showing different blood groups, but clear-cut categories. If you look back on continuous variation, it was more curvy, it wasn't defined basically. It's not defined. While in discontinuous variation, it is very much defined, clear-cut categories. And then this is literally a comparison table showing you continuous versus discontinuous variation. Just going back to it, discontinuous has distinct categories, continuous has no distinct categories. Examples of continuous variation, you have height, weight, heart rate, finger length, leaf length, is no clear categories. And then discontinuous is either you have it or you don't. There is no in between, there is no ish. It's either you have blue eye or you have black eye. There is no in between. Basically, the blood groups is either you have to fall into one of the categories. Versus with continuous variation, you don't have to fall completely into a category, if that makes sense. So you can be, for example, weight, it can be maybe 150, 150.5, it can be like maybe 150.6, you can be in between, if that makes sense. And then the graphs are represented very much differently, with the continuous variation showing a bell curve, while this continuous variation showing clear, distinct categories. Alright, so basically that's variation right here, comparing continuous and discontinuous variation, talking about the importance, how it arises, what it is, and yeah, so that